everyone. I'm Everdeen Mason, and I'm an audience editor and the science fiction fantasy columnist at the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. First, a few official words. First, a thank you to the co-chairman of the festival, David Rubenstein, and the other generous sponsors who've made this event possible. If you'd like to add your financial support, please note the information in your program. We'll have some time after this presentation for your questions, and I've been asked to remind you that if you come to the microphone, you will be included in the videotape of this event, which may be broadcast at a later date. And the author signing will be at line 18 from 5:30 to 6:30. So now that we've dispensed with the formalities, I am pleased to introduce our guest today, Justina Ireland. Justina is an author of middle grade and young adult books, and her most recent, the critically acclaimed Dread Nation, is a bestseller. You may also know her as a strong advocate for diversity and inclusion in the publishing industry, using her voice in fiction, in essays, and on social media to hold truth to power and to make sure that marginalized voices are heard and represented fairly and accurately. Dread Nation is a continuation of this work, using action, wry humor, and yes, zombies, to explore racism and the power structures built from it. Now I'll get out of the way so you can see who you actually want to see, Justina Ireland.
I brought this really big bottle of water, and they gave me a little one, so it's very awkward. So you guys have to pretend like it's not there. Like she said, my name is Justina Ireland, and I'm going to tell you a little story today. I'm going to write a chapter for my book, Dread Nation, mostly because I am woefully unprepared at every point in my life. I got an email from my publicist a couple of weeks ago. They're like, oh, how's your presentation coming along for National Book Festival? I was like, what? So kids, be better at your life than I am. Let's see. The section I'm going to read from you today has zombies. It's a little violent, so if anybody's sensitive to violence, it's not terrible, but it's there. And Dread Nation is really about a book. It's a book about a girl named Jay McKean, and in her world, the Battle of Gettysburg ends in the zombie apocalypse, which seems legit. And so what happens is slavery kind of ends, but really doesn't. Instead, we have a system in which people of color and indigenous peoples are expected to kind of learn how to kill the dead, or in her world, shamblers, so that everybody who's in power, white people, can be safe. And so this is kind of her relating the first time she's ever seen a zombie back when she was on her family home of Rose Hill Plantation. Chapter 3, in which I relate my first encounter with a shambler. When I was little, back at Rose Hill, I used to sneak out of the kitchen, away from Auntie Aggie, while she and the other aunties worked to feed all the hungry mouths on the plantation. Once they were distracted, I'd tiptoe out past the ovens and slip away to freedom in the fields. Rose Hill mostly grew tobacco, which Mama and a couple of the bigger field hands would ride into town to trade for cloth and other essentials. Early on, back before I can remember, Mama had tried growing tomatoes and other vegetables. When it became obvious that her small bundle of tobacco was worth more than all the food combined, she switched. Mama is savvy like that. The dead may have risen and we might have been living in the end times of Revelation, but folks still wanted their tobacco. The tobacco plants grew tall, and the leaves were broad and green. In the summer, I could duck down and run through the roads undetected, which is what I did on this particular day. My goal was always the same: find the other kids, the ones that got to run the fields because their mamas weren't ladies who owned the plantation. The kids I liked best would be near the barrier fence at the far side of the tobacco fields, so I made a beeline for that patch of trouble. A barrier fence is the line of security between shamblers and the rest of us, and Rose Hill has 3 such fences: white painted fence rails that had been our original property line and weren't more than pretty decoration, a dense forest of wooden poles with sharpened ends implanted in the ground at an angle that worked like stakes to impale any shambler enterprising enough to get to it, and at the outer edge, a wall of 5-strand barbed wire that was our primary defense against the dead. Once or twice a day, the stronger men would go out to the barbed wire and end any shamblers tangled up in it. Mama would have them bring the corpses in and burn them for the compost pile. If there were any valuables on the bodies, Mama and a couple of the men would sell them in town, bringing back something fine. One time, there was a shambler that must have been a fine lady, since she was decked out in gold and jewels. Mama used the baubles to buy several hogs, and that was how Rose Hill came to have pork chops every Sunday after the scripture was read. But I didn't much care for that business. I was more interested in the children who hung out playing games in between the fences. I scrambled over the white split-rail fence and carefully picked my way past the sharpened stakes of the interior fence. And there, between the safety of Rose Hill and the danger of the outside world, were the plantation kids. Everyone on the plantation but Mama was a Negro, all excepting for Mr. Isaac. There had been other white men, once upon a time, but after the dead rose, they'd either ran off or turned shambler. Mr. Isaac was different. He came to Rose Hill after the war. He lived on the plantation because he was married to Auntie Evelyn, and relations between Negroes and whites were frowned upon. Mama didn't much care for, as she called it, the spiteful leanings of biddies with too much time on their hands, and welcomed folks into the house staff as long as they didn't make too much trouble and were happy to work hard. So Mr. Isaac and Auntie Evelyn lived on Rose Hill with a passel of boys, the worst of which were the twins. Auntie Aggie said twins were an ill omen, and anyone who knew the Isaac twins would agree. The boys were light-skinned, lighter than me, sandy-hued with unnervingly blue eyes. They always had a scam running, like the time they'd stolen a watermelon from the garden and climbed up a tree to share it, or the time they'd let loose all the dogs as a distraction so they could run off to fish in the creek on the north side of Rose Hill. The Isaac twins were always up to no good. They were my favorite people in the whole damn world. "Hey there, Jane," called Ezekiel, Zeke for short. "Aw, Jane's here. Now we're gonna get the strap for sure," said his brother Joseph, who was saltier than Lot's wife. "I snuck off," I said, as the other kids began to give me dirty looks. "Ain't no one know I'm gone. What are you doing?" Each of the kids held a stick, the end sharpened, and it had the look of someone with a secret. "None of your business. Go back to the kitchens," Joe said, picking up a rock from the dusty ground and throwing it at me. The rock missed by a mile, but the one I picked up and flipped back at Joe didn't. It hit him right in the middle of his forehead, and as he cried up, I picked up another rock. "Next person throws a rock at me is getting what for right between the eyes," I said, shaking with anger. "No one's gonna throw any rocks, Jane. You should come with us. We're going to kill a dead." Zeke smiled wide and handed me a sharpened stick. While Joseph was prickly and hostile, Zeke was all smiles and warmth, the kind of person people like to be around. And he had the best ideas. It was no wonder Joe was so touchy. Who would want to share such a wonderful brother with everyone? I took the stick. "What do you mean, kill the dead?" "There's a shambler stuck in the barbed wire. We're going to kill it." "That ain't a good idea." As soon as the words were out of my mouth, I knew it was the wrong thing to say. But I couldn't help it. I liked trouble as much as the next kid, but this seemed different. Dangerous. "We're going to kill it so that we can go on patrols with the rest of the grown-ups," Zeke said with a grin. "No more chores for us." "You can stay here, Jane. No one wants you tagging along anyway," Joe said. I set my jaw. Whatever Joe said, I was going to do the opposite, just to spite him. "I'm coming. You probably ain't found a shambler anyhow." "Oh, it's a shambler, all right," Zeke said. "You'll see." We marched in silence along the line of fence rails. A few of the kids began to whisper excitedly, but a single glance back from Joe shut them up real quick. My stomach surged and gurgled, roiling with hot dread. I'd heard Mom and the other farmhands talk about how the dead worked, how they came out of the brush, overwhelming the unwary and wary alike. That was what made shamblers so scary. Even when they were predictable, they could still surprise you. As we rounded the corner, a loud moan split the air. There, twisted up in the barbed wire, was a shambler. We stopped, and all the celebration and shouting died down real quick. I'd always imagined the dead as some kind of monster, mouth gaping as it came to eat you. The shambler caught in the barbed wire looked almost normal. A white woman with long brown hair pinned up on her head, wearing a day dress of green linen. The skirt was torn, and her petticoat showed through. Her eyes were the yellow of crookneck squash, and the nails of her grasping hands had been broken down, her fingers covered with dirt. Still, I recognized her. "That's Miss Farmer. Her family owns Apple Hill Plantation," I said. Miss Farmer hadn't cared for me. She thought Negroes shouldn't be allowed in the house since we were dirty. But she loved Mama's blackberry jam enough that she came to call every so often when it was safe to travel. She ain't nobody no more, Joe said, poking her with a stick. The shambler growled and reached for him. Joe danced out of the way, much to the delight of everyone, even me. I ain't sure why we thought poking the shambler with our shopping sticks was a good idea, but everyone started doing it, creeping in close enough to stab the creature, then dancing out of the way before her hands could reach us. The game might have gone on longer if the dead Miss Farmer hadn't managed to pull herself free. Barbed wire ain't a long-term fix for shambler wanting in on a plantation. Since they don't have any kind of survival instinct, it's no big deal for them to eventually pull themselves free of such an entanglement, ripping off great big swatches of themselves to do so. And this is exactly what the undead Miss Farmer did. One moment, she was jammed up in the barbed wire. The next, she was stumbling toward us, half her dress and a good bit of arm skin left behind on the fence, which now listed to the side. Most of the kids, myself included, screamed and ran. I took off for the field of shopping sticks, knowing that would slow the undead woman down. But when I looked over my shoulder, I realized that not everyone was with us. Joe was standing right where he'd been, not moving, frozen in the path of the dead woman and her gaping maw. The boy had always been a bully, and the thing about bullies is they never learn how to run like the rest of us do. So Joe stood his ground, shopping stick at the ready, convinced he was going to kill the shambler. At some point in the woman's lunge toward Joe, he realized that a stick wasn't much of a weapon against the dead, but it was too late. Joe was about to be shambler chow, if it hadn't been for Zeke. It was Zeke that slammed into Joe, pushing him out of the way of the woman. It was Zeke the woman bit, sinking her teeth deep into his throat. It was Zeke that cried out like a wounded animal, trying for a few precious moments to push the much heavier woman off of him as she tore away a great chunk of flesh. And it was Zeke that let out one soft, anguished cry as his life bled out into the dirt of Rose Hill, the sound almost indistinguishable of the noise of the dead Miss Farmer feeding. "Joe!" I yelled, and the boy looked at me, expression distant and caught somewhere between grief and horror. I ran back to where he'd landed, pulled him to his feet, and dragged him by the hand through the field of shopping sticks to the safety of Rose Hill. As we ran back, we passed the patrol coming to put down the dead. I didn't stay to watch. I'd seen enough carnage for one day. They say when they got there, Miss Farmer had started on Zeke's face, and that 2 of the men vomited before they even got to putting her down and driving a nail into Zeke's head so he wouldn't come back. Mama gave Zeke a proper burning and gave Mr. Isaac and Auntie Evelyn his ashes. Joe ran off a few years later, presumably to one of the combat schools, and so their heartbreak was complete. Auntie Aggie clucked her tongue and said, "Told you these twins was an ill omen." It took me a long time before I left the safety of the main house, and I never ventured into the borders of Rose Hill again, not until I came to Miss Preston's years later. I learned 2 valuable lessons that day. 1, the dead will take everything you love. You have to end them before they can end you, and that's exactly what I aim to do. And 2, the person poking the dead ain't always the one paying for it. In fact, most times, it's the ones minding their own business who suffer. That's a problem I still don't have an answer for. Thank you. Now, I have quite a bit of time, so we're going to do questions. Does anybody have questions? And it doesn't have to be a question about this book. Oh, come to the microphone if you guys have questions. I think I can barely see you. There's microphones, yes? Yeah. Who's doing? So yeah, go ahead.
Best writing advice you can give to someone?
The best writing advice for anyone is to read, and read widely. So the thing about reading is we tend to read the same things. If you like zombie books, you read a lot of zombie books. If you don't like zombie books, you don't. And if you like a lot of historical fiction, you read that. But the thing about writing is, depending on what you're writing and depending on who you read, the craft is different. So it's really a great idea to read as broadly as you can. Read nonfiction, read mysteries, read romance, and even if you're like romance or schmaltzy, but there's a lot of like you can learn about emotion and writing emotional scenes from a romance. So if you read widely, what's going to happen is you're going to start to understand how a story works. Because depending on what kind of story you write, there are different tropes and there are different functions within those stories that you're going to recognize. And also, you're just going to learn how like to really use words in a way that's different. Most authors, there's a point in a book where I will stop and be like, that is so awesome. I wish I had thought of that sentence. And like that was really going to help you when you go to the page yourself. Next question.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering, where do you get your inspiration from when you're writing?
I'm really angry, so angry, and the world just keeps giving me more inspiration. For a lot of things, so for example, there are zombies in Dread Nation, but the book isn't really about zombies. It's about a lot of other things that we deal with. It's about things like extrajudicial justice and power structures and who gets to have the American dream and who doesn't and why and what the stories were told versus the reality. Because the thing is like you can't sit person down and like, I'm going to talk to you about racism for 4 hours. No one wants that, right? That is sad making. But if you're like, I'm going to tell you about historical zombies, you're like, okay, I'm listening. That's a little different. And then I can kind of slip in the important message. And I think that's really, you have to find your inspiration from. Like, what makes you angry? What makes you happy? What do you think is important for people to think about and talk about? Because that's going to keep you on a page. It is really, you guys, it takes a really long time to write a book. So you have to really be willing to stick with that story for that entire time length. So my inspiration is what makes me move, and what makes me move is rage. Other people, it's love. Other people, it's just telling a story. So, yeah. Thank you.
So you you wrote a historical fiction book, and I wanted to ask you about your research and other historical fiction books that you like. And so first of all, what's your favorite historical fiction book?
Okay, so everyone always like, what's your favorite book? I don't have a favorite book, and this is why. I think whenever you read a new book, you find a new favorite book, right? There's always like, unless I really hate a book, in which case I don't finish a book if I hate it, because I'm not in school anymore, so I don't have to. And even now, there's like, the internet exists. Like when I was in high school back in the dark ages, like you had to go to the Barnes & Noble and buy the Cliff Notes if you wanted Cliff Notes. Now you can just Google it. It's like, what? That's amazing. But I usually read a book for 50 pages, right? And then if I don't like it after 50 pages, I'm like, I'm out. I pop smoke and roll out. Just because it's like I don't have time, and like life is short, and at some point I will die, and I don't want my last thought to be like, oh, if only I had finished War and Peace. So like, I don't like read long books unless they like really pull me in. The best historical fiction book I just read is. Stacey Lee writes a lot of these historical fiction books, and I think her last one she wrote was Outrun the Moon, which is about a girl in Chinatown in San Francisco. And I tend to when I read historical fiction, I tend to read it for perspectives that you don't get in the classroom, or you don't get like every time like 4th of July comes around. I'm like, I don't need another story about George Washington, right? Like, I know what the dude did. Like, we get it, George. But I think, like, I really want to know, like, those perspectives that we haven't heard traditionally through history. I was in college the first time I realized that, like, history wasn't all just, like, white dudes. I was like, oh, crap, there are other people there, too. Thanks, Howard Zinn. So, like, I mean, like, I think it's really important to, like, to read those perspectives. And so that's what I tend to read. Okay, so that was only your first question. What was your second question?
I was just going to ask about, like, how you take the past and then you twist it, like, into a different narrative. Like, how do you do that?
So, that is the secret to life. Look, historians do it all the time, man. Like, all your history books are, like, the story that some dude decided was the truth, right? So, like, okay, so, like, my undergrad is in history, and like I almost finished a master's in history, and then I went and did an MFA instead because, thank you, because that's what I do with my life. I never finish things. But the thing about history is it's all about people, and it's all about people reacting to the events of the time. And if you know people and the people mindset of that time, you can change history to say whatever you want it to be. Like, I didn't know until this year that the Civil War was not about slavery. Like, that's That's amazing, guys. Like, all this time, I thought it was about slavery. It's about economics, apparently, even in case, or states' rights, one of those two. So, like, the idea is when you're writing historical fiction, especially if you're writing historical fiction and you're doing, like, something I do, where you're taking, like, a fantastical aspect and introducing it into the world, all you really need to know is these are the important events that happened, and these are why they happened, right? Because people react in a certain way because of their mindset at the time. And then you can write a book where you change all that. If you're writing historical fiction, my recommendation is to read first-person narratives at the time. So, like, I read 12 Years a Slave, and then I read, there's a whole bunch of, like, I read Frederick Douglass, right, talks about that. I have a friend up here, sorry, he's like flying around. And then like you can start to read these. But then also it's important to read the documents that are from that time period. Newspapers are a great way to figure out how people think about the day, right? Like if you go and you pull up like the Washington Post and like the New York Times, like the Wall Street Journal, you get a pretty accurate picture of how messed up this country is, right? Like, because you're like, whoa, these guys are not saying the same thing at all. That's brilliant. And you can do that with a lot of local papers. When I did my undergrad in Savannah, Georgia, and it was a bachelor's degree, and like for your final project, you had to like basically pick like a week of Savannah history and tell the story of that week. Because that's really what historians do. They take facts and they interpret them and they tell you a story. Sometimes those stories make sense. Sometimes those stories are just them trying to get their PhD certification. But that's what you do. And so I was reading this story in the Savannah Morning News, which was the paper at the time, and it was literally about how people were mad at this mailman. Like the postal carrier had like embezzled funds or something, because I guess at some point in history, the post office like held people's money, and people like really wanted to kill this mailman. And so there were like letters to the editor, there were different reporters talking about this. I mean, it was a postal carrier, dude. Like they were mad. They were really mad at this mailman, and I was like, this is brilliant. Like this tells you how important the mail is today. I mean, nowadays, we're just like, why do we even have the postal system? Let's cancel it, right? So, so I think that's really when you're writing anything historical fiction, the biggest important part is the people and the people's story. And that's one of the reasons you have to kind of read widely, because a lot of times the people who are telling the history are not the entirety of the people who existed at that time. So you want to find those hidden stories as well.
Thank you. Thanks.
Is there another question? Please be another question. I think my last card was like 15
Hi.
minutes. Hi. Thank you.
You're very interesting.
Did my mom call you?
I will be honest. The reason why I say that is because I'm a high school librarian, and I have a book service through Junior Library Guild that comes every month.
Yeah.
And your book, Dread Nation, came through it. Never heard of it, never heard of you. And interestingly, it just came a week or two ago, so I haven't had a chance to look at it or read it. And it's on my desk, and I'll see it on Tuesday when I go back to work. But what's interesting is, for years, off and on, I've tried to get teens to understand the importance of history and reading. And when you first started talking and reading your story about zombies, I'm like, what does that have to do with racism, this, that, and the other? But listening to you, I'm going to go back, I'm going to read the book, and then I'm going to see how I can come up with ways to pull in your story as a means to cook them.
Yeah.
Because it's a different way of presenting information that they need,
Yeah.
but in a way I wouldn't have thought of, and that's why I said you were interested.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to take that as a compliment.
It is.
The thing about zombie stories, they're never about the zombies, right? The zombies are like this really gross metaphor for everything you hate in the world, right? Like, so George Romero's zombies are literally about capitalism and what capitalism does to people and how it makes people just kind of awful. There's a book called The Reapers Are the Angels by Alden Bell. It's a zombie book, and it's literally a book about grief and how do you let go of those things that don't exist anymore. And so like when you read a zombie book, if it's just about the zombies, the author did something wrong. Because like really running away from a rotting corpse is only really interesting for about 50 pages, and then I close the book and put it away. And so like really as zombies, there is a book, it's an academic book, so I mean, it's a little dry, but it's called Better Off Dead, and it's literally a series of essays about what zombies represent in the culture. The first introduction of zombie lore and myth into this country was after the United States occupied Haiti in the early 20th century, and it was kind of these stories to try to talk about how like Haiti was one of the few countries in like the Western Hemisphere that was completely independent of like white rule, right? So do we all know the story of Haiti? Okay, yeah. Someone said yeah, everyone else was like, ah. Okay, so Haiti had a revolution, Haiti had a revolution in the 1800s. Basically, all the people who were enslaved said, hell no, we're done, and killed everybody. It killed all the landowners. A lot of people fled to New Orleans, which is why you have like a kind of like that like French and Creole and like those very like mixy kind of city, and these different cultures kind of clashing. And then like after they burned all the plantations and took all the land and everything else, France came in and said, it costs us a lot of money, you need to pay us money. You need to pay us because that was wrong. And the United States was one of the countries that was like, yeah, you need to pay them, like, right? And so these very, like, these very terrible kind of, like, reparations were put into Haiti, and so that's why Haiti is still a very poor country to this day. But the first, like, incidence of the zombie lore was because Voodoo was one of the practicing religions there, and it's tied to a lot of West African beliefs. And when American soldiers went and occupied Haiti in the early 1900s, they were like, they're dancing in the fields, and they're dead, and oh my God, these crazy black people. And literally the evolution of the zombie myth is, oh my God, crazy black people. Which is kind of funny today because it still keeps going on. And so like that's one of the things about like when you're talking about history and you talk about myth and you're talking about what does it zombie really mean, because stories are never what they say, right? A dragon isn't really about like a fire-breathing lizard, you guys. Like, a dragon sits on a gold hoard. It's about people who control wealth, much to the detriment to others, right? Like, so these fantastical or fantasy metaphors, like, exist in all the books we read. It's just, like, are we seeing that? And that's really, I think, like, my friend Danielle Clayton wrote a book called The Bells, and in this society, nobody has any features, everyone's kind of born gray, and these magical women who are beautiful make them beautiful. But the book isn't really about that, right? The book is about slavery, and the book is about beauty standards, and it's about all these other like very complicated, hard to talk about subjects, because again, no one wants to hear you talk about beauty standards for 4 hours, right? But they will read a book. And so that's really like when you're back to like getting your kids to like connect with history. Like there are kids who love historical fiction. I was a kid who loved historical fiction. I didn't love like not seeing myself in historical fiction. That sucked. But you know what's even better than historical fiction? Zombies, because you can't get away from zombies. And I don't mean that like as like, ooh, zombies chase you. I mean that more like in the culture. So yeah, so I think like that's where when we read, especially in YA, one of the great things about YA as a category is it has the flexibility to say, I'm going to teach you important things about race with zombies and Civil War history, which you don't necessarily get a lot of in other categories. Adults are too bitter. Like we're like, oh, what are these zombies doing? That would never happen. 50 pages later, so you know, kids have a little more flexibility. You've been so patient. Thank you so much.
No problem. What are you reading right now?
So, okay, so right now, my brain is so tired. I'm reading a romance book. What is it called? It's by Alyssa Cole. If anybody knows her most...
by default, or...
the one with the sword maker?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I'm reading. I haven't started it yet. I just bought it, and I have a really early flight tomorrow. I'm like, tomorrow, you and me, guys. I love romance. I think the world is a burning trash fire right now, so romance has been like my go-to. And so like, yeah, so I'm really excited to read this book. The last book I read that I really loved was The Mere Wife by Maria Devana Headley, which is not a romance, and it's the retelling of Beowulf, but Grendel's mother is a PTSD war vet. And it talks about the nature of monsters and like who gets to be a monster and who gets to live in the castle. And it's just like I'm getting chills. I don't know if it's the air conditioner or the book, but anyway, it's a really good book, and it's not a very long book. It's like 270 pages, which to me is like so short now. And so it's really worth it. Yeah. So those are my Alyssa Cole. I love Alyssa Cole's books. They're like They're just so nice. And then Maria Devana Headley's Mere Wife.
I love Dread Nation so much, and you left it on such a cliffhanger. I can't wait for the sequel. But
Me too.
Yeah.
Writing is so hard.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I really loved was how relationships like evolve and change, or the sense of mystery that with Jane and her mother, and then with Jane and Katherine. So I was wondering, because it's not as spoilery, if you could talk about Jane and Katherine and maybe sort of your thought process behind that, the inspiration behind that, female friendship.
Yeah, okay, so if you haven't read the book, it's like a minor spoiler, but not really, because you knew what was going to happen. But in the beginning of the book, Jane has a girl she hates. She absolutely hates this girl. This girl is like her competition to be best at the school, and she's like, whatever, she sucks. Also, she's light-skinned, so she doesn't have to be here because she could pass as white. And by the end of the book, they're friends. Because I really am so tired of girl hate tropes. Like, really, when I sat down to write it, it was like, oh, yeah, she hates it because she's blonde and she's pretty and she's good at everything. And then by the time I got halfway through the book, I was like, man, this sucks. Like, this is terrible, Justina. You need to fix this. Because I literally have those conversations with myself when I'm writing. And so I want to talk about female friendships. So in YA, we have so many romances, right? And I love romance. But that is not the most important relationship in your life. Like, I mean, like, okay, and I say this as somebody who's been married like 20 years. But like, the female friendships, like, especially for women, the friendships you have, the friendships you develop, and why those friendships work or don't work, why they fall apart, to me it was like something I really wanted to talk about and explore. And I also wanted to talk about that difficult mother relationship, which I actually, fun fact, talk about in all my books, because all my characters are angry and have these very fraught relationships with their mother. And not because I have a fraught relationship with my mother, but because that mother-daughter relationship is really the first female relationship you have in your life. And I say female, but like obviously that includes anybody who, you know, considers themselves a woman. I don't want to try to limit that to just like biology. But like that is a very fraught relationship in your life. And it's at some point it goes from being nurturing to competitive. Right? Everybody's life that happens. It doesn't necessarily happen between fathers and daughters because the competition is not necessarily the same. And I wanted to talk about that idea of competition between women. Because I think a lot of times we let ourselves fall into these really terrible traps about we're in competition with each other, but it's like, no, we're not. Like, don't take this the wrong way, but men suck. Like, and they're like making you think you're in competition with each other so they can sell you body cream or sell you, pimple cream or like make sure you're so busy fighting with each other you don't notice that they're taking everything. And so I wanted to talk about that, like this idea of like a female friendship. And then also kind of like poke fun at the YA trope of like the mean girl and the girl who torments her. Yeah, I just think relationships with women are so like, it took me a really long time. So before I was a writer, a long time ago, when I was a little baby Justina, I was in the Army, right? And every girl I knew in the Army was not like other girls, right? But we were all there together doing the same things, suffering the same things, right? So I really wanted to take that trope and kind of stab it in the eye. Because we're all just like other girls, which is why we should all try to figure out some common ground and support each other. So that was my feminist platform. Sorry, I'll put my soapbox away. So,
thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, I have 2 minutes. So if anybody has one last question, you have time for one last question. Go ahead.
What's the best way to convey emotion in your writing?
You'd have to ask somebody who's actually good at writing emotion. I think you're like, I read your book, you're lying. Thank you. For me, I don't write emotion in the first draft. And the first draft is mostly just events and people responding to those events. Emotion comes later, when I know where the story's going and where I know where the character arc is. I would say the best way to write emotion is to visualize the scene. What is the character doing with their hands? Where are they moving? Like when I'm nervous, you can see I talk with my hands, right? So I'm all up here with my hands, like blah, blah, blah. When I'm sad, I'm probably looking down at the ground. So just think about like what people do with their bodies when they're feeling a certain way. You can tell me you're sad, but if you say like her eyes were downcast and her shoulders slumped, that conveys the emotion better than saying I'm sad, right? So think about that physicality. So, all right, you guys, that's all I have. Thank you so much for staying out.